Well, help is on the way for the drought-stricken residents living in the Horn of Africa. Australia says it is going to give more than $11 million to the World Food Programme to assist millions of hungry people, according to a report in the Sydney Herald Sun. But as VOA's Mariama Diallo reports, much more is needed.
Kaltun Noor fled her home in western Somalia to seek help in Mogadishu.
We endured hunger and we waited for the rains. Our livestock died and we had a farm we were forced to sell so we can travel to Mogadishu. By that time, we were eating grass.
Fardosa Farah walked for 25 days to get to the Dadaab camp in neighboring Kenya.
This drought wiped out everything we had. If there is anybody willing to remain there, then I think it is just attempted suicide.
Farah and Noor are among many Africans who've sought shelter and food at refugee camps in recent weeks. And as thousands more cross the border into Kenya, aid agencies are sounding the alarm. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres.
I have no doubt that Somalia is today the worst humanitarian disaster that we face in the world. Here in the outskirts of the Somali refugee camp of Dadaab, we have the most vulnerable of the vulnerable in the world.
Mofat Ngugi is a climate change advisor with the Bureau for Food Security at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He says one of the problems in East Africa is that people rely mostly on pastoralism.
In the Western Africa region, you find that a lot of the production systems are much more integrated in terms of agro-pastoralism. That is not typically the case in regions of the Horn of Africa where people are purely pastoralists. So their dependence is entirely on livestock systems.
Melinda Kimball, vice president at the UN Foundation, says there is an even deeper issue.
I think the underlying problem gets to governance and probably to some extent the inability of the public sector to invest in both the infrastructure, research, science, and innovation that's needed to change the approach.
Kimball says African farmers have been going through a rough time for years.
In the mid-70s, we saw the beginnings of new drought cycles that caused a lot of hardship and problem. In the mid-80s, we had the Ethiopian crisis, and we had recurring crises from about 1980 through 1998 or so in Somalia, Eritrea, the Horn of Africa. All of these areas are fragile lands.
But Mofat Ngugi says there are no quick fixes. So in June, the U.S. launched a new program, Feed the Future, aimed at fighting food insecurities.
Within Feed the Future, there is sort of explicit geographic focus on what is appropriate for particular regions, and the approach or the strategy that's also being pursued is one that develops markets, a value chain approach that facilitates not only increased sustainable production, but also availing markets to these communities.
Melinda Kimball says the general lack of rain and frequent droughts will continue to plague East African agriculture, but there are still ways to improve production.
You can do more water harvesting, more water conservation. You can identify better crops. You need to invest more in the lost crops of Africa, like cowpeas and yams, which are highly nutritive and very important crops, but not produced in big volume.
The United Nations says more than 2 million children in East Africa are malnourished, and 500,000 are in need of urgent life-saving actions. Also needed, more effective early warning systems to forecast droughts. Mariama Diallo, VOA News.